This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Sanford Levinson his new book, An Argument Open to All, Reading the Federalist in the 21st Century. Sanford Levinson holds the Garwood Centennial Chair in Law and is Professor of Government at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the author of numerous books, papers, review essays. His two most recent books, Our Undemocratic Constitution, Where Our Constitution Goes Wrong and How We the People Can Correct It, and Framed, America's 51 Constitutions and the Crisis of Governance. Professor Levinson, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
The book, and just keying off your title here, your subtitle, Reading the Federalist in the 21st Century. So why does the Federalist and the author, Publius, matter in the 21st century?
Well, it's an open question to the extent to which it does. The argument of the book, and I have to say, I didn't go into the book even necessarily expecting to write it, because it's informed by a genuine question. That is there reason for somebody in the 21st century who is not an historian of the 18th century or kind of an opportunistic law clerk or judge trying to mine the Federalist for some position on a contemporary issue of constitutional law? Is there a reason really to read it? And my conclusion is that to a surprising degree, the answer is yes. That Publius, and one of the things I do is to refer only to Publius. I'm not particularly interested in the historical personages of Hamilton Jay and Madison, or why they were writing the essay when they did in terms of the particularities of New York politics in 1787-88, but rather, do they have something to tell us today about 21st century politics and constitutional politics? That doesn't necessarily mean, incidentally, that every essay is full of wisdom and we read it in order to find out what we ought to do, but rather what I really was persuaded of, and as I say, somewhat to my surprise, is that each and every essay asks an interesting question that is still relevant to us today. And some of the times we're going to say they come up with the wrong answer. But who really cares? The important thing is to ask the right questions. And generally speaking, they do ask the right questions and offer interesting arguments which are worth grappling with. Let me say just one final thing. If you read the 85 essays in their entirety, and not only what I've come to call the greatest hits that most people are familiar with, assuming they're familiar at all with the Federalist, if I could change one sentence in my book, I would change the sentence that refers to the Federalist as the most often cited and widely read work in American political thought. It's clearly the most often cited, but I've come to the conclusion that it is rarely read in its entirety. It's not assigned very often any longer in most colleges or law schools. And so if people think of the Federalists, they think of the greatest hits, number 10, 47, 51, and 78. And they never think of the other 81 essays. Most of them have nothing to do with what lawyers or judges usually think of as constitutional interpretation. Rather, they're really about such central questions as why have a constitution in the first place, what sorts of challenges does a constitution have to meet, what sorts of traits do we expect out of political leaders? Why is it that confederated governments fail? And things like that. So that's why I do think it's worth taking the time to read all 85 essays, even in 2016.
Though this will be this comes as distressing news to me, working at Liberty Fund, given that Liberty Fund republished the Gideon edition of the Federalist.
Yep.
That you say most people have not read the Federalist Papers in full. I suppose that means in some measure we failed in our great endeavor there.
Well, I mean, one of the things I love about the Liberty Fund, and this is not idle flattery, is the wonderful books that are available at very, very affordable prices. I mean, I tell all my students recurrently to go out and buy your 5-volume Founders Constitution,
oh, excellent,
which is an absolute treasure trove. But unfortunately, it is the leading horses to water, but you can't make them drink. It is, I have come to the conclusion, an unfortunate truth that for whatever reason, the Federalist is much, much more often cited than actually read.
Yeah, no, that doesn't surprise me. Would you say maybe as one reason why it's not often read, and maybe this is a part of what your book is dealing with, is sort of historicist, deeply historicist mindset, both within our pedagogy and within, say, political science departments, which is to say, political or what is politically expedient or useful is something relative to the time itself or to present time itself, and there is really nothing worthwhile ultimately in going back to learn wisdom about constitutionalism or political thought.
I don't really have any well-formed theory. I think some of it is that it's written in 18th century English, and so students, I think, probably find it harder just to get into than stuff written in 21st century English. It makes allusions that at least educated readers in the 18th century either would have been familiar with or at some level were actually willing to learn something about. So, for example, 3 essays that I'm sure that very, very few people other than professional scholars have read, essays 18 to 20 about ancient Greek confederations and the Dutch Republic, and I think the Swiss Confederation, are actually very useful today if you're trying to figure out why Europe is having such immense difficulties. I think the quick and dirty answer is that it's a confederation and not a genuinely consolidated federation. But the real point is that Publius expected readers to be interested in essays that were full of references to ancient Greek alliances that, frankly, I've never read about outside the pages of the Federalist. And I think that to assign them to contemporary undergraduates, it's just so formidable, given the number of undergraduates who really can't locate in time some very, very basic aspects of American and world history.
Yes, indeed. In thinking about, you just mentioned Federalists 18 through 20 in the European Union, the problem being the European Union can't touch individual Europeans.
Right,
directly.
right.
Yes.
The critics of the Constitution in 1788 all criticized it for being consolidationist. And quite frankly, I think that's true, that the first 22 or so of the essays are unrelenting critiques of our first Constitution, that is, the Articles of Confederation, for having created what Publius called an imbecilic form of government. But what made it imbecilic is precisely that it was so weak and that it couldn't tax citizens directly, and frankly, states had way too much power. And the Constitution was designed to overcome both of those and to create a strong central government that could tax people directly, and that's not Europe.
No, definitely not. I wanted to think about a couple of themes, broader themes in your book that you write about that we find in the Federalist Papers. One is the idea announced in the first essay, the famous phrase, to found a government from reflection and choice.
Right.
And then in Federalist 9, you talk about the idea of the new science of politics that Publius believes has been located with this Constitution. And then there's another later theme, which I think is important, that you also talk about, and that's the idea of a Republican veneration of our institutions will be needed to uphold this Constitution, which I think is even more significant if we think about Thomas Jefferson's writing outside of the Federalist on the idea of if we're really gonna realize the social contract and the consent of the governed, it has to be renewed every 20 years. Each generation has to make its consent or give its consent anew, and then juxtaposed against that is veneration, and I think the new science of politics. And I wanted to ask, in thinking about how does all of this suss out in your mind in reading Publius? I mean, these seem to be all things that are contradictory if we think about them.
That's a wonderful question, and it helps to underscore why I emphasize in my own introduction that I'm writing about each of the 85 essays separately. The book consists of 85 short essays, each one about the corresponding number of the Federalist, and that I'm not going to make an effort really to tackle the issue, is Publius entirely consistent? Is there a single Publian theory, which runs up against the fact that it was obviously written by three authors, but you could also ask, well, was Hamilton entirely consistent, or was Madison entirely consistent? I think these are different aspects of Publius. I think that if you assigned number one to a relatively knowledgeable undergraduate class and said, look, read number one. Let me tell you that it was written by a famous founder. Who do you think it was? I think a lot of the students, including the very good students, would say, I think it was Thomas Jefferson, because it's full of optimism about the ability of ordinary Americans to engage in reflection and choice about how to be governed. And that's what you think of when you think of Thomas Jefferson. And then you would say, actually it was written by Alexander Hamilton. And again, the knowledgeable students would say, gee, I'm really surprised, because wasn't it Hamilton who said the people are a beast, who almost never come to the correct conclusions about important matters. And so depending on the course, you could go off and say, well, maybe the essays aren't always reliable as to what the actual authors really thought. And so then you have to ask, why did somebody using the name Publius lead off with an essay that really flattered his readers about their own capacity for reflection and choice? But it does seem to me that what is so incredibly important in the year 2016 about number one is that it really does ask the question of whether, when we look around at our fellow citizens, we see a group of people who are capable of engaging in reflection and choice. And if the answer is no, and you're certainly not going to be surprised to hear that when I ask this question in various places that I give talks to, including very much with students, many of them will immediately respond is, no, how could you possibly have any confidence in our fellow citizens? That if that is the case descriptively, then whether you want to call it a democracy or a Republican form of government, I really don't care about for these purposes, our polity is in big, big trouble because, ultimately the legitimacy of the upcoming election depends on the losers being willing to say, well, I disagree with what my fellow citizens decided, but, we're all capable of reflection and choice together. Reasonable people are going to disagree, and the meaning of our political system is that the losers will defer to the winners because we are part of a common polity. But the more we say no, we look around and we see people who terrify us, and I think there are more and more people across the political spectrum who have that view of one another, then you really do have to ask what the character of our political system is, and then what you can say, flipping over to 49, which is where Publius writes in an entirely different voice about the importance of veneration. You say, well, we really shouldn't open up the discussion about whether our institutions are necessarily well-serving us in the 21st century. As you may know, you mentioned my earlier books, I think the 18th century Constitution is significantly dysfunctional in the 21st century. I actually advocate a new constitutional convention, but in order to do that, you have to take Federalist 1 seriously. And most of my friends and family, frankly, think I'm crazy. But if, in fact, you are appalled, as most of my friends and family are, by the very idea of having a new constitutional convention, because how could I possibly trust we, the people in the 21st century, to make intelligent choices or to engage in the kind of reflection that would be required, then my question, which is a thoroughly serious question, is why do you have faith in the electoral process at all? Doesn't it really suggest something very terrifying about American politics in the 21st century if we are so contemptuous of the ability of most ordinary Americans to engage in reflection and choice? Because what else are elections than hopeful appeals to the electorate to engage in reflection and choice about the candidates, about the parties, about the various arguments they're making, and to cast something that we might want to call an informed vote?
A question on reflection and choice that comes to mind. You mentioned flattering those who would be reading. Reflection and choice also can be, and you think about the statement after that, and not decided by force and fraud. So one thing he's talking about is, European nation states, but force and fraud also referring to the Articles of Confederation and the likely outcomes if this continues to be allowed to unfold before them. And reflection and choice, we have it within us to get off this course of chaos and of the imbecilic Constitution. And that's the reflection and choice. My question, so we've had constitutional crises since 1787, 1788, one being the Civil War, another being the New Deal, or at least maybe the domestic politics policies urged during the New Deal, challenging a reading of the Constitution that then prevailed.
Sure.
My question is, do you find in those crises, have you thought about this, did they repair to Publian wisdom and thinking about those crises? And I guess maybe my follow-up question is, are you saying, and listening to you and reading your book, there are these whiffs of we're in a Publian moment now, perhaps?
Well, with regard to the events of 1861-65 were actually beyond, and I put it that way because actually, in a sense, Civil War is a misnomer. It was the secessionist movement, just as, for that matter, the American Revolution was the secessionist movement from the British Empire. Neither in 1776 nor in 1861 did the seceders want to take over the entire government. I mean, the Americans weren't going to send ships over to London to try to take over the entire British system, nor were the Confederates out to take over the entire U.S. government. What they wanted to do was to secede, and one of the great unanswered questions is whether the U.S. Constitution, properly read, allowed secession. But, there are two things. First of all, obviously Lincoln said the answer was no.
Yeah.
And secondly, the war was not over the abstract notion of secession or self-government. The cause of the war was slavery. And slavery was the great evil of the 1787 Constitution. It was the price of union was accommodating slavery and slave owners. And that decision was made because, as Publius emphasizes, particularly in the early Federalists, we had to unite or be threatened with perpetual war, either war among the various states, or if we ultimately ended up as two or three countries along the eastern seaboard, we would inevitably get tied up in the great European wars. The British would try to ally with one of these countries, the French with another, and it would be endless warfare. So it really was necessary to unite in a country, and the price of unity was accommodation with slavery. So that problem, to put it mildly, was in the original Constitution, and by 1860, it really was obvious that the House divided couldn't stand. And then the question is, what exactly was the war about? Not simply in terms of what were people thinking in 1861, but what were they thinking about in 1866 or 1868 or 1877? And there's a real spectrum on this. That one notion of what the war was about was no secession and no slavery. And that is achieved by a combination of Appomattox and the 13th Amendment. Another notion of what the war is about is no secession, no slavery, and a genuinely new birth of freedom. And in addition to that, shifting even more so than was the case in some ways in 1787, shifting power to a much more empowered national government. And this is what the 14th Amendment is all about. The 14th Amendment really does take away powers that the states had had prior to 1860 or 1868 and place them in the hands, depending on your theory of the 14th Amendment, place them in the hands of either Congress or the national judiciary. But in either case, it means decidedly weaker states. And in 2016, we're still fighting it out, what the deep meaning of the 14th Amendment is, and in turn, that's a question about the deep meaning of the war, which is in turn a struggle over the deep meaning of 1787-88 and the relative balance of power between a consolidated national government and states. One of the things that I think is so striking about Federalist 10, which I suspect is the Federalist essay that most people listening to us right now have read at one time or another, is that it is, I believe, relentlessly anti-state, that states are cesspools of what Publius called government by faction. And the way to overcome government by selfish factions, and this is part of the teaching of the new science of politics that you referred to a moment ago that's mentioned particularly in Federalist 9, is to move to a larger stage, that is the national government, which will be less likely to be faction-ridden and more likely to govern in the public good. Now, you may or may not, at the end of the day, be convinced by the relative optimism of the notion of what Publius calls the extended republic. But the important point for me is that the Federalist is full of cold water, throwing cold water on the idea that states are really going to be the place for virtuous government and the protection of liberty. So there's a real irony for me about the fact that Justice Kennedy, say, loves to cite certain passages from the Federalist that are more optimistic about states and refer to states as providing a double security for the protection of liberty. It's not that Publius didn't say these things. Over the 85 essays, he said a lot of things, some of which, as you pointed out, with regard to 1 and 49, really are in tension with one another. So it's not surprising that over the course of 85 essays, you can find some paragraphs that do speak well of states. But what I argue in the book is that if you read the 85 essays together and don't simply cherry pick number 39, for example, which is more favorably disposed to states than almost any of the other essays, you'll get a very different picture from the one that Justice Kennedy tries to convey. And the temptation with any authoritative source, whether it is the Bible, the Federalist, or any other long and complicated book that is taken with some special seriousness within a culture, the temptation is always going to be to cherry pick. Yeah. To look for those isolated paragraphs which will reinforce what you think anyway, and to ignore everything else is inconvenient. Yeah. And so, as I say, I think it really is illuminating to read all of the 85 essays, not because there is, at the end of the day, a single, completely consistent Publian philosophy, but you realize how many of the essays raise very, very challenging critiques of notions like, let's just count on the states, and things like that.
The question on the new science of politics, coming back to that phrase here, one thing that comes to mind is the bargain that's struck and the type of, maybe the method of politics we see in Publius that he's relying on, consensual, institutions-based type of Republican government, not overly relying on, say, the judiciary to get you out of jail, or as you're arguing here, the states aren't always going to get you out of jail. But yet there does seem, and it's also interesting to keep in mind, one of the members, Madison, certainly no friend of the states initially in the Philadelphia Convention with the Virginia Plan, and also Alexander Hamilton, also no great friend of the states. But yet they come around. I think part of it is the bargain struck definite or defined and limited powers in the national government, and then the great reserve of powers being left to the states. That seems to be a crucial part of the bargain. And yet, so in that regard, maybe the states now are safe in certain respects because they've been tamed within this overall structure. And in that respect, if they're tamed, then then we can show them and appeal to them the ways in which they benefit from the structure. That seems to me a crucial part of their strategy in Publius. And also, the passages Kennedy cherry picks. It seems that one can't ignore the crucial element of the compromise within the Philadelphia Convention that the states retain. So, it's a qualification on democracy. It's a qualification of self-government that the principles are the individual citizens. That's why we're doing this. But it's individual citizens acting in certain ways through a medium of the state. Those will retain. And we don't have to go with Calhoun and say the states are the principles, but there's a mediation, I think, in what they're proposing there.
Right. I two of my own essays. The political sociology of federalism. I think they're essays 17, and I know that the other's 46. One of them happens to have been written by Hamilton. The other happens to have been written by Madison. But what unites both of them, and the reason for my own title, that is the political sociology of federalism, is that I think that what they put forth as the main protection of states and the vitality of state government is not anything really written down in the Constitution. Because one of the things that's striking about the American Constitution, in contrast to a lot of other constitutions around the world, is that there are remarkably few specific powers that are guaranteed to the states. I mean, in other countries, sometimes states or provinces or Länder or whatever they happen to call themselves will be assigned exclusive authority over education or exclusive authority over the religion of that particular province, or this exclusive authority to decide what the central languages will be, or control of the oil or the diamonds or whatever happened to be the geographically dispersed natural resources. You don't find any of that in the U.S. Constitution. So what Publius says is the real protection for states is the psychology of ordinary citizens. They're going to feel most closely linked to states, and they will view the national government as a faraway, distant government that will be doing a few important things, but at the end of the day, not all that relevant to the daily lives of the people. And the people are going to know their local representatives. The federal representatives, say, will be distant and far away. But then the hooker is that Publius says, well, if there is going to be a shift of sentiment to the national government, it will be because people start looking around and see that the national government is in fact effective and is responding to certain problems, and their psychology will slowly but surely shift to being, frankly, Americans rather than Virginians. And I think that the great challenge facing the United States in 1787-88 is creating a sense of national identity that really didn't exist particularly. That I think people's primary identity was as New Yorkers or Virginians or North Carolinians. It was very, very much an open question whether we would become Americans. One of the essays that I'm most interested in, and I think it might even be the longest of my own essays among the 85, is Federalist number 2, where Publius proclaims that we're all basically alike. Same religion, same national background, same language, same as what he calls manners. And this is preposterous. It was preposterous in 1787. It's even more preposterous today. But what interests me is why Publius thought it so necessary to say, well, you know, all of us from Massachusetts down to Georgia are really the same. Because if we didn't develop some sense of national identity, then the project was ultimately going to be doomed. And this is the meaning of 1860, that the national identity didn't take. Robert E. Lee ultimately decided he was a Virginian. And although I don't think in 2016 we're close to civil war, the kind of constitutional crisis we had earlier, that being said, I think the division of the United States into red states and blue states, which began basically as television stations trying to figure out simply what color to assign Democratic or Republican states, I think that a lot of people today really do view themselves as either part of red state America or blue state America. And even if you happen to be living in a state that's going to vote the opposite way, a Democrat in Texas or a Republican in California, but I think still there is a feeling that maybe our national identity is more fragile than we thought. Yeah. And there are people who look to the national government as a source of solutions to our problems, who respect people who work for the national government, who think that we probably should pay our civil servants more than they now get because the jobs they do really are important. And then other people who view them as pointy-headed bureaucrats who are taking us down the road to perdition. Yeah. And I think ultimately these are questions of political sociology and political psychology about which Publius has some very, very interesting things to say.
Question for you. We mentioned the cherry-pick Federalist and talking about Federalist 10 here. So Federalist 10 famously says, enlarge the sphere. That will be the great protection of liberty. And you talk about this at length in your book with regard to the dominant political theory they're dealing with, which is Montesquieu and the small republic being necessary. Right. So he says, enlarge the sphere. This will have the effect of breaking up faction, preventing oppression by the majority, things like that. It'll be harder to form an effective faction, all this sort of stuff. See, and so then you're talking about this idea of red state, blue state, or what's my identity, and it calls into question though one question: politics as warfare. And it seems to me clearly we're in that moment. Yep. And we can talk about all the causes. I mean, that it really becomes a long conversation. Why is our politics warfare? Even our slogans, war on drugs or no child left behind, all these sorts of things call to mind. Well, there is no compromise. You're either with us or you're a black sheep. And it seems Publius in Federalist Trend is trying to prevent that, but he's trying to prevent it, I think, through a compromise and consensual government. But maybe what's unspoken is how do we the people maintain this form of government? It seems what you and I are suggesting is maybe certain techniques he thought he could rely on haven't held. And that sort of, I think, raises the question, how do we the people remain virtuous, or maybe I'll put it more democratic, like how do we maintain the capacity for self-government and justice?
Well, I don't think you could possibly ask a more important and disturbing question. That I think that the answer Publius ultimately relies on, but with great uncertainty. I refer in not only this book but in an earlier book to what in the earlier book I called the Madisonian Anxiety. In this book, I call the Publian Anxiety. The anxiety is, on the one hand, to view ordinary human beings basically as selfish and likely to be disposed to a factional form of politics. So how do we escape this? How do we avoid politics simply turning into a kind of Hobbesian war of all against all? The promise of number one is, I would argue, the almost Jeffersonian faith in the people to engage in reflection and choice. I don't really think that is the answer it offered in number 10. I think what number 10, and not only number 10, suggests is that somehow or other, people will be willing to elect as national leaders or state legislatures, who, of course, were electing senators then. We didn't have popular election senators till the 20th century, or the Electoral College that was expected to be a serious institution rather than the extraordinarily strange and bizarre institution that it has become by the 21st century, that there was a certain level of confidence, though an anxious confidence, in number 10, that we would be graced with political leaders who would have the virtues to think of the public good rather than their own selfish factional interests, and along the way would be willing and able to engage in the necessary compromises of politics. That itself is part of virtue, to know when civil peace and achievement of your primary goals will require compromise.
Yeah.
Do we believe that in the 21st century? That is to say, do we believe that our basic electoral institutions work well to identify a leadership class that we can really trust to engage in a kind of virtuous politics? And quite frankly, and again, I really don't think it matters where you are on the political spectrum, I think most people would say, no, I don't trust these people in Washington or in Harrisburg or Sacramento. I mean, I think for only relatively few people do they say, I really love my state leadership and not the federal leadership, or I really love everybody in Washington, but I don't trust any of the people in Austin. There is, I think, a massive alienation of most Americans across the political spectrum from their so-called leaders. I mean, I think the
evident in both parties right now.
Right, and I think the scariest polling data has to do with support or approval for Congress, because it has been now for several years that on a very good day, Congress might get up to a 15% approval rate. That is, 1 in 7 Americans thinks Congress is doing a good job, whereas in the most recent polls, I think 80%, 4 out of 5, disapprove of Congress. They don't have confidence in Congress. This is not merely a proxy for where you stand on the political spectrum. Presidential approval rates probably are. Right now, Barack Obama is actually doing very, very well. He's got a 53% approval rate. And you can say, well, that's probably a pretty good proxy for the current percentage of Americans who might well identify themselves as Democrats or leaning Democratic, as opposed to people who are Republican or leaning Republican. But with Congress, or for that matter, the Supreme Court, which is now, for the first time in history, under 50%, I don't think you're measuring political party. I think you're measuring something much, much more profound, and something that should disturb us, because we are faced, again, wherever you are in the political spectrum, everybody agrees we're faced with very significant issues, even if we disagree on what the top 10 issues might be or on what the solutions might be. But nobody, I think, says everything is just terrific right now. And I think there are few people who would say, we really don't need effective political leadership at all because things are going so great without it. And so then you ask yourself, well, how did Publius think we would get effective political leaders? You read Federalist 68, in which Publius offers a defense of the Electoral College. And anybody reading it in the 21st century would say, this is just crazy. In fact, a friend of mine, Mark Raber, who teaches at the University of Maryland, said that after reading number 68, the only conclusion you can come to is that the Federalist should be filed under fiction in public libraries. Because what 68 says is that the Electoral College will predictably select out people of incredibly sterling character who will provide us the kind of leadership, energy, vision we want in a president. And of course, one of the things that Publius does is to defend a strong president. But we shouldn't be worried about having a strong president, because the Electoral College will assure that we'll also get a good, a virtuous president. And, to put it mildly, when you look at our current political season, but not only the current political season, we've now had a sample of 44 presidents. I'm sure we would agree that some of them really have been fine and upstanding, but I'm equally certain that we would agree that some of them weren't, and we could have a really serious discussion wherever we are in the political spectrum of whether the current political system is either generating people with the Publian virtues, or whether people with such virtues are likely to, in fact, to be elected. That you could really wonder if the Publian arguments make any sense today. But one of the principal arguments of the book is, as I said at the outset of our discussion today, is not that you should end up saying, aha, Publius got it exactly right, and he gives all the answers, but rather to say, well, if you believe that he did get it fundamentally wrong in his optimistic description of the way the Electoral College would work, or how it is that we would overcome the Publian anxiety, then we really should sit down and have very serious conversations with one another and try to figure out if there's a way of escaping the depression that many, many thoughtful Americans across the political spectrum have about contemporary American politics. Or if you look at politics around the world, it's scarcely the case that you would say, in, fill in the blank of some country, they've gotten it just right. That I think there's a general feeling and general anxiety about whether the political system of any country or any group of countries taken together is adequate to the challenges that face us.
Yeah. Professor Levinson, thank you so much for being with us and for discussing your book, An Argument Open to All, Reading the Federalist in the 21st Century. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.